I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is almost the Chinese Literature Podcast.
This is our first prologue? I don't
I
know how
guess
you sort of like that.
addendum.
Addendum.
Rob, are you still alive? It's good to hear you.
Still hanging in there.
The listener may not know this, but I actually, maintaining social distancing rules, walked all the way down to Rob's house with my daughter on Saturday just to deliver some beer.
A mission of mercy, a Red Cross medical supplies drop.
Some sort of inebriated Red Cross. I guess that's the one that Ernest Hemingway worked for.
I
Yep.
love it. Yes.
We actually are. It's now April 2020, and we're in the COVID-19 pandemic. We earlier, several years before, recorded a podcast on the Zi Jing that we never put up. That's the podcast that's going to follow this. But we have another Zi Jing podcast, Rob, that you just edited that we're going to put up in a week or two. I don't know, Rob. When you talk to people about the podcast, do they realize that we don't, record and then magically put things up immediately?
No, I don't think most people know that we have like a bank of podcasts.
Yeah, and sometimes some of those podcasts just don't get up. And talking about doing this Zi Jing podcast that you're going to do, right? And it's COVID-19 related. So
it is the Zi Jing as propaganda. My wife took a photo when we were in China of a propaganda poster using the form of the Zi Jing to tell people to do things like wash their hands and wear their masks.
So obviously we had to go ahead and put our first Zi Jing recording on.
Otherwise, it makes no sense.
So this is just I think your word is best, Rob. This is a prologue to our Zi Jing podcast, which was recorded during the Yellow Jacket protests in France. And so you'll hear us referencing things that are completely not contemporaneous.
Although, I have to say, Lee, in a way, it's a shame we're recording this because then people would maybe get the impression that we're traveling back in time to record podcasts, which would be awesome.
Well, every time you open a book, you sort of travel back in time. Every time we read Chinese literature, we are definitely traveling back to the author's time, right?
Spoken like a true nerd.
That's a philosopher. You mispronounced the word
philosopher. They're interchangeable terms.
All right, Rob, stay safe and on to the regular podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, thanks for joining us on Skype.
I know, this is crazy. You're interviewing me. Actually, you're not really interviewing me, but we're doing this long distance. It's happening.
How is Gay Paris?
It's, I was about to say it's pretty gay, but I'm pretty sure that would get us in trouble somewhere. But it's cold, it's dark. It doesn't really matter because I'm in some pretty incredible and beautiful libraries all day, so it could be cold and dark all at once. But if it's cold and dark, it might keep the yellow vests down.
Have you actually encountered too many yellow vests, Rob?
Not too many, but yeah, I mean, you run into them, especially if you get out of the cities. The rural areas get a little dodgy. We took a drive to Strasbourg out in Alsace a couple of weeks ago and had to actually drive around a couple of roadblocks. So it made me feel kind of cool. You're like, wow, that's a gas station someone burned down. I feel like I'm in some kind of action movie. But then my two kids in the back seat started crying. I was like, yeah, you can't have an action movie with kids crying in the back seat.
That actually sounds like a great twist on the action movie if I don't.
Fleeing to Revolutionary Guards with your kids. Like, shut up, just be quiet. Go to sleep.
I mean, the most famous action movie or action poem, the Aeneid, sort of starts out like that.
That's true. That is true. Basically, you're saying I'm like Virgil, so I appreciate that.
I am saying exactly that. But also, the discussion of family is quite relevant to today's text because, Rob, you're now a father twice over recently, and I'm about to become a father. And so we decided to choose this text because of that. The text that we're looking at today, Rob, is the Zi Jing. So that's the 3-character classic, which is a famous pedagogical text from the Song dynasty. It's not really clear who it's written by. It's attributed to two different gentlemen, Wang Yinglin and also O Shizi. The truth is we really don't know much about its composition. It was written in the Song dynasty, and it became a very important pedagogical tool in the Ming and the Qing. In 1796, it was actually even translated into Manchu, which this text is so...
Yeah, how would that work?
Yeah, so I guess we should tell the listener a little bit about the text. It's called the 3-character classic just because it actually has 3 characters in every line, and their poetic rhythm to it makes it very easy to memorize. It's an amalgamation of all of this Confucian knowledge, and then it's, I don't want to say dumbed down, but kind of, it's made for children. So this is essentially ancient Confucian children's literature, right?
Yeah. Yes. And it reads that way for sure.
Would you mind, Rob, or do you want me to read out the first 4 lines?
I can read it.
Okay.
I can read out the first.
Yeah, could you read it in Chinese and then translate it?
Sure. 认知出，性本善，性相近，习相远. So as you can see, it's kind of a sing-songy, and there's a lot of Chinese poems that have very firm end rhymes and rhythm schemes, but the fewer characters you get, the more sing-songy it becomes. You just can't really avoid it. Mm-hmm. And that's this one was designed to be that way.
So my translation is as follows. From the beginning of a person, human nature was originally good. Their nature is all similar. Nurture makes them different.
So my translation reads, in humanity's beginning, their nature was fundamentally good. In nature, they were similar to each other. In practice, they grew distant.
So,
which is sort of all of human history in 12 characters.
This poem really reflects a kind of Mencian tradition, right?
Yes.
How so?
When we talk about perspectives on human beings as fundamentally good or bad, Confucius was always a little fuzzy about this. Mencius is really the one who sets out this doctrine that people are born, human beings in the human species begins good. It's after that, when they start doing stuff, that things start to fall apart.
So I wanted to point out that not all Confucians believe this. There is Mencius is Confucius's one of his earliest disciples. He is very big, and he represents the orthodox tradition of Confucianism. That when people talk about Confucianism today, they're talking about Mencius's interpretation of Confucianism. But there are other Confucians early on who dispute this claim that people are originally good, particularly the philosopher Xunzi, who's following a generation or two after Mencius. He actually thinks human nature is bad. So
those things are bad, actually. Very pessimistic philosophy.
Very pessimistic. Mencius's philosophy kind of can be summed up in a story form. Mencius tells a tale of a child almost falling into a well. A person walks by. A person would naturally be inclined to try and save the child. No matter how bad they are, that's just their nature. They're going to try and save that child. That signifies that human nature starts out as good, and we all have these innate good things going on in our heart. And it's only through practice of bad things, that is, in terms of nature versus nurture. Nature is good, nurture makes us bad. And only through study, Mencius would say, only through study can we actually keep that good nature, which I think is kind of a contradiction, right, Rob? If nature is good, why should study, which is essentially a form of nurture, make us good, but other forms of nurture make us bad?
Right, but you're also sort of oversimplifying education or teaching, because it's not any old teaching whatsoever. It's teaching of the way, the Dao, the way things are supposed to work. We should also bear in mind that Mencius was advisor to multiple rulers in the region, and he had a very practical approach to this stuff. He didn't just stand on what seemed like street corners then and teach this stuff. He wanted to actually put these things into practice, and it wasn't just go to school and learn your lessons and you'll be a good person. There are multiple passages where he is advising various kings in the area to basically make their people ethical, moral creatures. So there's a hierarchy to this teaching too. It's not just the school teacher. Everything begins with the lord of the region and moves down from there. Fair
enough. I guess as someone who is heavily influenced by Zhuangzi, I would argue that it seems weird to say that the Tao is natural and the only way to make sure you stick with the Tao, the way, is by interfering. But
right, but then again, this is the classic split, right, between Confucius and Mencius and then Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu, is this: what do we do to become the sort of people we're supposed to be.
Or
and Confucius and Mencius talk about things like, actually, I think better than education, I think, would be the word cultivation, right? You cultivate the self through following the rites, through being a filial son or daughter, all of these various practices and teaching as well. Whereas Zhuangzi and Laozi are like, yeah, that's sort of not the point. The more you learn like that kind of stuff, the farther you're going to drift away from the Tao, the way.
a Taoist would say, you're asking the wrong question if you're asking, how do I do this? The point is to not do this. Is there anything else we have to say about this poem?
Well, it's peculiar because even though there's only 3 characters per line, there's a definite logical structure. In fact, you and I talked about how hard it was translating the last 2 lines, and I don't like my translation, you don't like yours. And my particular problem was, up to that point, you can kind of follow the logic, right? People start out good, practice makes them bad. They start out similar to each other, there's unity and whatnot, and then they start doing things, they drift apart. So that makes sense, right? There's a line later on that I translate as, then if they are not taught, then they move apart. They continue to separate. Again, it's kind of a logical thing to say, right? Yeah. But then the last 2 lines are very, very hard to translate because the logic just doesn't seem to work. There's one character in that line where I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem to make any sense.
So we're talking about line 7 and line 8, just to be specific in the poem.
It's literally something like the teaching of the way or teaching them the way, and then value, the second to last character, yi. If you look it up in a dictionary, it takes up like 3 pages all by itself. So if you're thinking to yourself, hey, I'm going to look this thing up and figure out how it works, you're kind of in for a rough time.
Yeah, and I think that hits on a larger point that I wanted to make with this poem. This is a 2,000-character poem, so it's not super long. Something that sing-songiness that you were talking about at the beginning, it makes it fairly easy to memorize, and that was actually the point, is that children memorized this when they were young, and it kind of was a stepping stone to actually memorizing the real Confucian classics, because although this is called a classic, it's so late, it's not really a classic, but it is kind of like my first little Confucian classic, a Fisher-Price version of the Confucian classics, if you will. But even though it's meant for kids, it's still in classical Chinese, and there are these really hard to understand phrases that, although they're simpler than these archaic Confucian classics, they do still cause problems with translations. And I was looking up translations both into English and into modern Chinese of those lines 7 and 8 that we were having trouble translating, and there's a lot of disagreement. Like I couldn't find a consensus on the meaning of those 2 lines. So my point is that even though this is children's Confucian literature, it ain't necessarily easy.
We're not talking about the Berenstain Bears here. Yeah, but it's interesting because there's, even now in China, there's still a large presence of classical poetry, classical philosophy like this in elementary school textbooks. I remember when I was learning to read Chinese, my neighbor across the hall would bring me his granddaughter's readers from school, like first grade readers, our version of first grade. And they were already memorizing poems like Du Fu and stuff in there. There's no way they had any clue what the poems were really talking about. I was with the rhyme and the meter. But the problem we get with languages like French and English is you have these long polysyllabic words that kids are like, yeah, I'm not going to be able to tell you a word with 5 syllables. But in Chinese, it's syllable by syllable by syllable. It's easier to memorize. And it's an interesting phenomenon that you can have kids memorizing something they just simply don't understand.
I was going to make the point. I think a lot of times understanding is less important in that Confucian context than just memorizing it. And we grin and say, oh, that's the old way, and look down on that. But there is definitely something to be said for having the kind of mental access to these poems where you've already memorized them, that we as modern folks, and I'm including Chinese folks and Westerners in this whole basket, that we as modern people maybe don't get in the same way that someone 400 or 500 years ago in either Europe or China would have understood that much better.
Well, and because there's this notion, especially in Europe and the U.S. and the traditions that produce those places, that if you're going to read something, you have to be able to, on your own, individually process what you're reading and respond to it. You have to have your own thoughts about it. That's a fairly recent idea, even in Europe.
Yeah.
By recent, I mean the last couple of hundred years.
Yeah, that's the Renaissance, right? That's an Enlightenment and Renaissance.
Yeah, certainly after that. And in a lot of other cultures, even now, really, the idea of memorizing something doesn't mean I am now going to read this for myself and figure it out. Sometimes it's simply having that thing there. You don't have to do anything with it. It will come up. You'll have some means of accessing it later, but the idea that you have to talk about it is not really part of the tradition.
In the last 20 years, Google has made because you have these kinds of literatures quite literally at your fingertips, but even innovations like cheap print media in the last 100 or 200 years has made the availability of these poems such that you really don't need to memorize it, but I still think you lose something. As we start to wrap this up, Rob, I just have a question. Are you going to ask your sons to memorize the Zi Jing at all?
I think we're going to do the whole thing. I think we're going to do all. How many lines are there? 1,000 characters.
So there's 2,000 characters. So 2,000 divided by 3.
It's like 6.5, something like that.
Something,
600 or 700 lines.
Yeah.
Yep. I think that's going to be my next move. My son is able to do 15-piece jigsaw puzzles right now, so I think he's pretty much ready for the Zi Jing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this. If you were a good Confucian parent, this is about the time you would start to introduce that. Which we know you are, Rob.
I am a full. I support the idea of filiality in its extremist forms, and the kid doing everything I say, especially going to sleep at night.
Before my child is born, I'm going to play recordings of the Zi Jing in utero so that they
over and over and over again. Holy moly! That's going to be a weird. Well, it's going to be a weird kid anyway, because it's going to be your kid. But it's going to be even weirder.
All right. Well, Rob, I think this has been a really great discussion. Thanks for coming all the way from Paris to rainy Oregon.
Thanks. No problem. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.